I'm realizing now that cheating doesn't come up that much, so I feel like we should fix that. Player brings his own DM screen and personal dice tower to the game. Insists on using both because the DM gets to roll behind the screen, so why shouldn't he? Also, he calls it his lucky tower. Yeah, I bet it is. The table is barely big enough for just the character sheets, by the way. His giant wooden DM screen obstructing everyone's view of the game. For the record, I shot this idea down faster than lightning through a wet dog. Well, thank God for that. The real horror story isn't the attempted cheating. The real horror story is the lack of room on that damn table. This story makes much more sense with some context to back it up. At the start of the story, I had recently been getting acquainted with a new friend group after meeting my boyfriend. We met through an MMO, and I joined up with his guild. It's a relatively small group of pretty tight-knit friends, and we have a Discord server where we hang out and play games together. As it turns out, a couple of other people in the Discord were into tabletop games, and after getting to know them for a bit, I offered to run a Pathfinder game for some of them. At the time, I still didn't know most of the group super well, so I invited the people I got along with and started setting things up. I was pretty excited to be DMing again after nearly 2 years of being away from it, so I didn't vet people too carefully. That was a big mistake on my part. The cast. Me, the GM, a longtime GM and player who should probably have seen the red flags a mile away. GMing Pathfinder with a fair bit of homebrew at the behest of 2 of the other players in the group. Priestess, the star of our tale, playing a tiefling cleric dedicated to a homebrew god of redemption. A first-timer with Pathfinder, but not with tabletop gaming as a whole. A friend of the group who seemed kind of awkward, but generally okay at first. Fox, one of the 2 players who initially convinced me to DM a game for the group. An experienced player playing a kitsune samurai lord. Fox's knowledge of the system is incredible, which will come up as we move on. Wolf, the second of our experienced players, playing Fox's retainer, a Rakshasa-blooded tiefling samurai. He GMs a Star Wars tabletop game for the same server. Probably the most easygoing, relaxed person I know, yet even his patience was tested by the aforementioned priestess. Raven, my boyfriend, a newcomer to Pathfinder playing a Dampier summoner. He was pretty quick to pick things up, despite being unfamiliar with the system. Phoenix, a friend of my boyfriend's, new to Pathfinder but not to tabletop, playing a Samsarian cleric at first but later switches to an Ifrit sorcerer. Bones, a mutual friend of the group who joined a bit into the campaign, playing a Tabaxi witch. Part 1. The early days. The first signs of disaster began before we even started playing. I decided to run a politics-heavy game focused on kingdom building and intrigue. Think Kingmaker meets Game of Thrones. Set in the northern country where the king had recently perished with no legitimate heirs. The party were on board with the idea and we got together to make characters and talk shop. Fox and Wolf both bought into the premise heavily and rolled up a pair of samurai, a young lord and his retainer from a far-off land, come to make their fortune in the volatile lands of the north. Raven decided to play a scion of one of the noble houses of the area, striking off on her own to prove herself. Phoenix chose to play a cleric of the magic goddess, useful in both adventuring and advising capabilities. All in all, they fit pretty nicely, and I was happy with how their characters turned out. Priestess was another story. Their initial character concept was fantastic, an elven bard who was a priestess in exile of a neighboring kingdom. The backstory was a little cliche, but it was ripe for political intrigue and fit well into the theme of a group of young, ambitious people trying to make it big in a kingdom's power vacuum. So I was all for it. Yet, that was not to be. A few days before we started, Priestess approached me wanting to change their character. We hadn't started yet, so I figured, sure, why not? Their next concept was a tiefling cleric, a priestess to one of the local gods, and a local figure for the game's starting town. It struck me as a little odd, since they didn't have a hook into the intrigue side of the game, but I figured they wanted to lean into a supportive adventuring role, I guess. The character was also very similar to the PC they had played in Wolf's Star Wars campaign, but with a fantasy flavor. I brushed it off as them wanting to get used to the system within their comfort zone and help them to make a new sheet. However, one thing became apparent as we went. They were dead set on having the half-succubus template instead of the usual tiefling race. Now, I'm no stranger to odd character builds. I don't usually shy away from weird ideas, and I'm happy making them work as long as the table is fine with it. I'd also done some homebrew stuff with the other players. Fox and Wolf ran a duo build revolving around Fox shape-changing into a giant fox that Wolf rode into battle. So I was on board with helping Priestess do something unusual. We eventually settled on a solution, allowing him to use the template bonuses in place of point-buy stats, as they ended up close in value. But I probably should have taken this as a sign of things to come, given their odd obsession with this template they wanted. This was not the only peculiar thing about Priestess's character creation. The other players had all come to the table with relatively focused backstories. Each was concise, but gave them clear motivation that left me some room to play with using the backstories for plot hooks. Priestess, on the other hand, offered a few vague sentences about redeeming her past and struggling with her inner demons before writing up page after page of backstory about her parents, neither of whom were alive or relevant to the story. As far as I can tell, the backstory was never finished, and to this day, I couldn't tell you how any of it relates to the actual character. The first session rolls around, and things go pretty well. The party meets up on the road, sheltering together from a heavy storm, before deciding to travel together to Priestess's home village. Along the way, there were plenty of great roleplay moments and an introductory combat with an owlbear. I was very pleased with how things went, and since the players expressed a desire to continue roleplaying after session, I made a secondary Discord where they could roleplay and chat about the game. Smooth sailing so far, I thought. But our Priestess's problem started to rear its head in the second session. The group busied themselves doing favors for the local town to gain the audience of the local lord, as low-level adventurers are wont to do. However, I began to notice a pattern. Priestess would only really do two things. The first was make lewd jokes. Now, this isn't normally a huge problem. Everyone at the table is an adult, have similar senses of humor, and generally don't mind an occasional raunchy joke. However, it became quickly apparent that Priestess would turn 90% of their characters' dialogue into these jokes with justification of being half succubus. On top of the jokes, they made their character as extremely promiscuous as possible, which was uncomfortable to say the least, especially considering the player in question was a grown man in his mid-20s. By the end of the second session, it had gotten real old, real quick. I told them to tone it down a bit after the session, and they agreed. The only thing Priestess would do was preach. Specifically, extremely aggressively preach their god's will at everyone and everything that might potentially have ears. At first, it was mostly the villagers, which made sense given that Priestess was their local cleric. It stopped making sense when she tried to preach at a rampaging troll. She also tried to preach to the party, all of whom had their own deities and cultural beliefs. Oh, and basically every living being that she came in remote contact with. Even more bizarrely, Priestess, or at least the player behind them, didn't exactly seem to know what he was preaching about. Prior to the session, the player had asked for details about his character's god, and asked that they be a lawful good deity to fit their character's themes. No problem, I thought. I wrote up a few paragraphs of lore for a deity whose faith focused on personal growth and redemption, with the intent for them to be very accepting, open-minded, and they could fit with the priest's internal struggles. The only thing they would truly not tolerate was an evildoer with zero remorse. As far as I could tell, redemption is the only word Priestess could read. Her usual routine usually involved telling everyone that he met that they must confess to her, heavily implied to be sexual at every opportunity Priestess found, and atone for their sins, regardless of whether or not they had actually done anything wrong. Priestess also made the point that any other way of atoning other than her word specifically was wrong and should be punished. Strangely, Priestess never did follow up on that, nor did she seem to have any desire to fight anything at all. After a few sessions of absolutely nonsensical attempts to convert and or have sex with anything capable of locomotion, I was starting to get weary of Priestess. The other players didn't seem bothered, as Priestess was a pretty quiet player. While their interactions could be grating, they were few and far between. The Priestess seemed like they were well-meaning, just kind of awkward and weird, with a strange behavior that never really came up when we hung out outside the session. This continued for a few months of play, with things going mostly great, save for an occasional moment where Priestess said or did something awkward that left the table kinda uncomfortable. This all changed around the 6-month mark. By this point, the game had developed a great deal. Bones had joined up as the party's 6th member. The party had acquired a small border fort and were now moving up the ranks of nobility. The party was moving in to assess their new property and clear it of long-standing hauntings when the first major incident occurred. Around halfway into the session, the party found a secret laboratory in the cellar of their new fort. I went into detail describing it, as well as the big oddity in the room, the long-dead corpse of a massive ancient construct. The party was quick to investigate, including Priestess. Most of the party went for sensible lines of investigating, such as knowledge checks, searching the room, etc. Priestess then decides, spontaneously, that perhaps praying near the creature will awaken it. I shrugged to myself and described that she prays beside it, but it does not react in any way. After all, it is a dead body. Notably, this was not the first time she tried to do this, as early in the session, she tried to proselytize at a zombie with about as much success as you expect. Priestess, unsatisfied, attempts no less than 4 diplomacy checks to convince a corpse to wake up. At this point, I'm confused, but try to gently point out that the corpse it's dead. It cannot be reasoned with diplomacy. This frustrates Priestess, seemingly, and she continues to attempt to prompt a reaction out of it via preaching, last rites, and other religious measures. At this point, it has been a solid 20 minutes of this nonsensical line of thought, and the rest of the party is both frustrated by these antics and ready to move on, as they were unable to uncover any clues. They had decided to ask someone who might be familiar with constructs instead. So I try to push things onward. Priestess, 2 more checks later, finally decides to let it go, but at this point, I can tell the party just wants to call the session, as Priestess has stalled for nearly half an hour and the party's groove had very much been lost. We called the session shortly after clearing out the rest of the fort. A couple of the other players remarked in the Priestess episode after session, and we all agreed that maybe it was a mechanics confusion. Priestess had struggled a bit with combat and other mechanics in Pathfinder, so we thought that maybe the player didn't entirely understand how diplomacy worked. Fox and I tried to talk to him afterwards and tried to explain that in general, diplomacy doesn't work very well against dead things or creatures incapable of rational thinking. Additionally, we tried to explain that while a high diplomacy roll helps, it won't let you do the impossible or convince something of a totally irrational argument. This concept never really seemed to root itself entirely into Priestess's mind, as he, as his character, still tried to convince undead creatures with diplomacy on multiple occasions. The diplomacy incident was shortly followed by the strangest change I have ever witnessed in an individual. Priestess, outside of the session, had always been a pretty chill person. He seemed kind of clueless and a bit weird, but otherwise pretty pleasant and well-meaning. This changed basically overnight. I make a point of keeping out-of-game drama far away from the table, but Priestess had no such qualms. For context, the MMO group we were part of had been growing rapidly and eventually split based on different opinions on how an MMO guild should be run. Priestess was friends with the person who wanted to split off the group of friends and do their own thing, but that person left them out of the decision. Priestess, understandably, was pretty upset. Unfortunately, at virtually the same time, the remaining members finalized our roster for the new raids that had just come out, and Priestess was not on that roster. We understood how MMO drama could suck. Friends being shitty people sucks. Being excluded by people you care about, that sucks. And we tried to be supportive of Priestess whenever we hung out or had a session. However, Priestess began acting unimaginably paranoid. He became extremely quick to accuse people of acting behind his back, trying to exclude him from activities or bad-mouthing him. At first, we figured this kind of behavior was just an awkward guy trying to cope with crappy circumstance. We consoled him as much as we could and hoped it would blow over. After all, Priestess had otherwise been a pretty nice guy out of game before this. Maybe it was just a rough patch. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Over the course of the next few months, Priestess became steadily more frustrating to deal with. The previous annoyances with their character had become more pronounced, and their out-of-character behavior was getting worse. Despite our attempts to be comforting and help him through these issues, he continued to lash out, give an empty apology, and then lash out again. This led to a long list of incidents over the next few months of the campaign. In an effort to keep the story from being ridiculously long, I'll just include some of the highlights. These include complaining on multiple occasions that his character was useless or didn't do anything in combat. Fox and I tried to explain on many occasions that clerics are typically a supportive class and showed him some spells that might help. We also suggested that he could rework his character to be a class he might like better and fit into his character's stats more. Priestess pointedly did not take any of these suggestions. Priestess's anxiety over being useful in combat apparently was strong enough to cause him to lash out at other players during their jobs. On multiple occasions, he complained that Fox's samurai did too much damage, and at one point grew despondent and huffy over Phoenix healing the party in combat. Priestess would categorically refuse to look up anything himself, despite the whole party's numerous attempts to try to teach him the system. Priestess refused to spend any time reading Pathfinder Wiki or searching up any easily found answers to the questions he had. We even tried to show him the resources. Priestess would also constantly complain that we never helped him, even though we sat down and walked him through nearly everything. On multiple occasions, Priestess left the session with no explanation. During the climactic dungeon crawl of the biggest arc of the campaign, he disappeared for an entire session. No word. Priestess had a habit of making enemies in character, then whining that nobody liked Priestess very much. Some notable incidents of that included incinerating another player's undead familiar after being warned that channeling positive activity into an undead would kill them, then refusing to admit that it was his fault and trying to blame someone else, another player, Phoenix, instead. Repeatedly trying to antagonize Fox's character over the death of Wolf's first character, blaming him for everything that went wrong, and accusing him of being an awful person who ignored the common folk, while the party was trying to help those common folk. The reasoning? Fox's character didn't want to sleep with Priestess. Approaching Raven's character after she lost her title in an attempt to gaslight her into believing Priestess was the only one she could trust, despite constant manipulation. Between sessions, the party would often post in the roleplay server. Priestess thought it would be a brilliant idea to post a 3-paragraph description of how they were succumbing to their urges and needed someone to write that instinct. It was borderline erotic roleplay in the public chat of a server where everything else was kept PG-13. Needless to say, the post was taken down, and I informed Priestess that that sort of content was very inappropriate. It didn't happen again, but I suspect from his response he never understood why that wasn't cool, especially unsolicited. Needless to say, between the increasing paranoia in and out-of-game character misbehavior and the uncomfortable roleplay, the whole group was getting real tired of dealing with Priestess. We had tried our best to be accommodating during a rough patch, but 3, almost 4 months later, nothing was improving. At this point, the sole reason we kept him around was fear that it would cause drama to bleed into a larger group. Something had to give. As we conclude the second major arc of the campaign, I decided it would be a good time to try to talk to everyone privately and have a talk about what was going well with the campaign and what wasn't. The group agreed that Priestess was an issue, and things were starting to get tense with the continued behavior both in and out of session. I decided at that point that I was going to give Priestess one more chance. I took him aside between sessions and laid out the party's issues in very plain words. I told him that the constant complaining and paranoia was frustrating. The in-character issues were causing part of the party to stop wanting to play, and that I want to give him a couple weeks to work on it together. Otherwise, I need to ask him to leave the game. Surprisingly, he took it decently well and agreed. I tried to help him with his character again. I suggested some good spells, some class changes, and even some homebrew options. He instead demanded that I make an entirely new class to fit his preference. So that didn't happen with success, and the issues continued. He continued to start trouble in character and continued to complain during combats. I finally gave up when he DM'd me mid-roleplay session to complain that no one liked his character, and when I explained why people found Priestess frustrating, I was told I was telling me I can't play my character the way I want. The following night, I put my foot down and just asked him to leave. He did not take that well and promptly demanded that I find him a new campaign before I asked him to leave this one. As one would expect, I did not do that. I told him something I should have months before. He needed to learn to do things on his own. I wasn't happy to kick him from the campaign, but we'd all had enough. Priestess immediately went on the group chat to have a crusade, prodding every single member of the group and trying to get them to say who wanted him gone and why they hated him, complaining that I was an unfair DM and didn't have a right to kick him from the group, and trying to get them to allow him back in. Nobody bit that bullet, but it was enough to finally snap Wolf's patience, who who had been the only member of the group who wanted to give him another chance. It's been a few months since Priestess left the game. Surprisingly, he's still kicking around the MMO Discord due to being friends with a lot of the admins. We haven't talked much beyond a few awkward conversations since then. Our game, meanwhile, is still going strong and we've been having a blast. We've invited a new player who's been great fun, and the game is better all around. Still, I end up thinking about Priestess a fair bit. I honestly feel pretty bad for him, as losing your place at an RPG table really sucks, but there's only really so much people can take. I wish I could have done things better and nipped the issue in the bud much sooner, but you live and you learn. TLDR, player plays an obnoxious succubus priestess who tries to have sex with / convert everything in sight, brings out game drama to the table, and demands that we find him a new game once he's finally given the boot. Just on the surface, this is the most real RPG horror story I've covered, just because this guy, for the majority of it, is honestly not that bad. Yeah, he's annoying for the first 6 months. He definitely has bad habits that you need to learn from as a player. This is the most real RPG horror story I've covered, just because the Priestess problem player isn't really that bad. Yes, they absolutely have some annoying habits and some weird things that they do in-game, especially trying to convince corpses to do what they want. But when you look at the big picture and look at some of the other stories I've read, this is not that bad at all. It's perfectly manageable, but the thing that really drives it over the edge is out-of-game drama, which is perfectly realistic. I have seen that happen plenty of times in my personal experience. And I definitely disagree with the OP when he says, oh, I try to keep out-of-game drama out of the table. That's a great goal. You should try to do that. Like, I don't try to discuss out-of-game drama at my D&D table. It's not something I actively try to engage in because we're trying to play D&D. However, if you think that you can just avoid stuff that happens between friends, interpersonal relationship stuff at a D&D table, that's crazy. You're playing with a group of people. It's not like their lives fade away when they play Dungeons and Dragons. They still exist. If two people at the table hate each other, that absolutely is going to affect the game. Now, of course, that is not exactly the context in this story. In this story, it was a separate event that happened in the larger group. But when it comes to just out-of-game drama in general, you definitely need to be conscientious of that, because it does matter. You're playing with a group of people. Their lives don't fade away when the game starts. When the dice hit the table, their out-of-game drama, it's still on their mind a lot of the time. So just be conscientious and sensitive to that. But yeah, this guy definitely wasn't ideal. He kind of showed some true colors at the very end there with demanding to find another game from the OP, which is obviously really crappy. The behavior of that guy at the end of the day was definitely bad. It just devolved, and it really sucks to see a game ruined like that, but I'm glad they managed to recover and find a new player. If you enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment, convince the zombie to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.